The Lord showed me something new this week about the story of David, and I wanted to share it with you. So in the story of David, David is anointed as king as a shepherd. And while he has been anointed as king, Saul is still on the throne, and it's not quite time yet for David to step into that position. And God is so amazing. His brilliance never ceases to amaze me. I mean, I am just in awe of him. And in God's perfect foreknowledge, he made a way for David to get some training on how to be king and the kinds of things he needed to be aware of and watch out for as king. You know, God made a way for him to get that education in secret and before he stepped into position. And how God did that is just so beautiful. So I have read and, known for a long time about how when David would play his harp, it would bring the demon-tormented King Saul peace. But I didn't really understand the fullness of why that was until this last week. And the reason why Saul would feel peace is because the demon, the demonic attack he was under, would be lifted. Because demons do not like it whenever someone is praising and worshiping the Lord. Now, we worship the Lord in all kinds of ways. In the way that we take care of our bodies, in the way that we respond when someone has wronged us. But we also worship the Lord in the way that we utilize our giftings and our abilities. So I personally do oil painting. And I never feel closer to God than when I'm oil painting. For me, it was something that I did not do as a young person. It was something that I didn't go to school for. I didn't know that I had this gifting until later in life. And when I'm standing at the easel and this painting is coming to life, I am just in awe of God, and I am just worshiping him because I know that this is something that he gifted me. And I am realizing that in playing the harp, David was worshiping the Lord. You know, I met this friend who plays the violin. And he told me a story about how he first got started. He was really struggling with, reading music and learning to play in the traditional way. And so what he did was he started to just take his violin to his room where he could be alone and talk to God about it. And he said to the Lord, I want to do this. This is something that is my heart's desire. But for whatever reason, I'm just not able to get it and to learn it in the traditional way with this music teacher. God, you show me. You lead me. You bring this that is burning in my chest. Bring it out, Lord, for your glory. And God began a work in this young man that was truly just a supernatural experience. This young man began to play the violin from his heart. He began to play in worship of the Lord. And it took his playing not just to, a professional level, but beyond. I mean, this guy is an amazing musician. But, it wasn't something that was taught to him by another human being. It was something that God cultivated and brought about in this isolation, in this intimate time alone with this young man and God. And now I'm understanding that that's how it was with David and his harp. When David would play his harp, he was worshiping God. He was having this intimate encounter with God, and he was praising him, and he was worshiping him in his playing of this harp. And King Saul had a tormenting demon put on him. And so in God's perfect foreknowledge, with David having been anointed as king and yet having no real understanding of the dynamics of the relationships and the demands and all these other types of things that were going on in the palace, he was going to have to deal with situations and with circumstances that were completely foreign to him. And so God placed David into a position where he was not only needed and able to stay close to the king and see all of the dynamics of how the palace was run and the various types of relationships and people operated in this way. You know, he was able to get sort of a backstage, front row seat, you know, to the inner workings of the palace. And he was able to do that, number one, because Saul needed him. Saul needed to have moments where he truly was able to get peace, which came from David's playing of the harp. And, you know, the reason that he got peace was because David playing his harp was a form of worship. So as David sat there playing, he was worshiping, he was praising God. And that demon, it would leave. They hate that. Demons do not like to hear the worship and praise of God. And so as that demonic attack would be lifted, Saul would experience peace. And so, you know, the Lord was able to place David into the palace without him immediately taking on all the responsibilities of a king. But initially, he was able to be in the palace and be an essential part of, you know, how things were able to run without being seen as significant. David had been a shepherd. David had come out of nowhere, and no one knew, you know, really who he was. He was this outcast son of Jesse. You know, when the prophet came and he was attempting to anoint David, Jesse thought so little of David, he didn't even bring David. He brought his other sons. And the prophet Samuel said, this is not him. Finally, he has to ask Jesse, do you have any other sons? And Jesse is like, oh, you know, you can't mean David. And so David was outcast even amongst his family. And we see that in the story of David. We also see it in the story of Joseph. But, you know, he's this outcast son of Jesse that it's very likely that few people knew him because he was out tending sheep. He was out in the distance taking care of the sheep. And so suddenly, you know, David has come into the palace, and he's an essential part of the way that things run in the palace because Saul, the king, needs him. He needs him to play his harp so that he can have those moments of peace. Why does it bring him peace? Because David comes in and begins to just sincerely and authentically worship the Lord in his playing of this harp. Now, from this behind the scenes position, David is able to see all the things that nobody sees. He sees how the king behaves whenever he's, pretty much alone, because David, being perceived as so very insignificant, would have caused the people in the palace to really let their guard down. I mean, who was he going to tell? The sheep? And it's been my experience that when you have nothing, people really reveal themselves. When they don't think that they can get anything from you, and they certainly don't fear you in any way, then they let the mask down and they truly reveal themselves. So this gave David a very unique and priceless opportunity to be able to see how the palace functioned and how people really were in that dynamic. He was able to see in some ways more than even Saul knew, because he was able to see how, let's just say, Saul's children acted in front of the king versus how they acted and what they had to say when the king was absent. He was able to see firsthand that the life of the king is not perfect. It's got its own unique challenges and huge stressors. It's a lot on your shoulders. He got to see that firsthand. How honest people will be with the help. How honest that they'll be with their hairdresser or the massage therapist or the maid. I mean, the help is not in the same social circles. If the help does tell anybody, who are they going to tell, right? And if they did have someone to tell, it generally does not affect the lives of those people in those upper echelons of society. So this offered David a huge opportunity to be able to see how things were actually run in the castle, in this palace, behind the scenes, things that even the king, even someone put into the position of king, would not have been able to see. And so, God showed me something so profound. He showed me that when He has a calling on our lives, He's going to prepare us. He's not going to just fling us into it. And when we have a calling, a lot of the training, a lot of the transformation that has to take place will take place in private. It'll be something that is just between us and God, or maybe just us and God, and a couple other people might be witness to some of it. But another thing that the Lord showed me is that by the time that David, gets to the palace, he's already got this huge mountain-moving faith. He had already had these incredible victories that nobody knew anything about. God had taken David into this season of isolation where God had truly just spoken to him and moved in his heart and showed him all these amazing things. And then he gets anointed as king. And he knows that this amazing thing is coming, but has no understanding of just how exactly it's going to work, because at the time, Israel already had a king. And in David's time of isolation, God had delivered the lion into the hand of David. God had delivered the bear into the hand of David. And these are huge victories. And David's got no one to tell. David experiences these incredible victories alone. in isolation. And then David gets this opportunity to be in the palace and to really get an understanding of how things work and how people really are when they've removed the mask, when they've let down their guard, when they're truly just being in their natural state. And the people of the palace, they didn't know that David had been anointed and would soon be their king. So David got to see how people really were and how they acted towards him. And I can tell you from personal experience, I think, there's just a priceless bit of education that you get from having nothing. Because whenever you have nothing, you really see people. And I think that there's also great significance to the fact that when Jesus walked the earth, when he was born to a carpenter and a young mother, and that young mother eventually became a single mother, a widow, and then in his years of ministry, they had nothing. There's one passage in the Bible where there's a guy that's saying he wants to follow Jesus, and Jesus is like, "Are you sure? Are you sure? Because the foxes have holes and the birds have nests, but the Son of Man's got nowhere to lay his head." Jesus was homeless. They were out there without a place of their own to rest. And, as they came into any situation, they really saw people. Not the way that they would have behaved had he shown up looking like a king with an entourage and all kinds of riches and expensive clothing and servants. No. The behavior that people would have had towards someone that looked like a king was far different from how people behaved towards Jesus and the disciples when, by the natural eye, they just, they look like peasants. They look like nobody. And you see this play out in the story of David. He's able to really see people when they, didn't believe that they had anything to gain by being nice, and when they believed that if they were mean, there wasn't much he could do about it. He really saw them. And he saw them not just with regards of how they treated him, but also how they were with the king. In front of the king versus behind the king's back. So, my message to you today is that if you are going through a season of isolation and you've received the promise, you've received a dream or a word from God or something, and you've got that promise, God is doing something special, but it is just year after year of difficulty and struggle and isolation and betrayals and hard lessons. I just want to encourage you that is no different than how God has prepared other people in the Bible, like David. Like Joseph. Let's talk for a minute about Joseph. Joseph had gone through years and years of betrayals and hardships after he got the promise, after he got the dream. And after he's been betrayed and sold by his brothers, and then betrayed and put into prison, from Potiphar's house. And then he's in prison, and he's been there for years and years, and he's forgotten about by, the guy that he interpreted the dream for, and you got to just imagine me and Joseph, and he's got no logical reason to believe that things are ever going to change for him. If he's just looking back at his experience, there's no logical reason there to believe he's ever getting out of that prison, or that anything is ever going to, change. That anything's ever going to be different for him. And yet, one day, he wakes up in that same prison cell, and that night he goes to sleep in the palace. God is a God of suddenly. He will change your circumstances regardless of the fact that you don't have the resources. Joseph didn't have any kind of money or resources or, the network of contacts that would have ever gotten him even one toe into that palace. Much less to be moved in and be a resident and to be second in command. So don't worry when you're thinking about the dream, when you're thinking about the promise. Don't concern yourself with how it's going to happen. Because chances are, if God told you, you wouldn't believe it anyway. There's a word in the Bible that is translated as dismayed. There's actually two different words that are translated as dismayed. And one of them means to be stuck in the headlights, kind of, just caught and frozen with what's happening. Okay? And the other one is to be distracted and consumed with the thoughts of how is this exactly going to happen. So God says, do not fear, do not be dismayed. Don't get frozen, don't be consumed with the thoughts of how is this going to happen, because it's fruitless. It's fruitless to be wrapped up in that. We simply don't have the ability to wrap our minds around all God has done from beginning to end. We cannot fathom it. And so to accept it and to just experience life in joy, in praise, in worship, with a childlike faith, that's what God wants for us. And He also wants, when we step into those positions that He has transformed us and prepared us for, He wants us to put great significance on what He thinks and what He wants and how to please Him. And He wants us to have little to no concern about what people think. Because the Bible tells us, don't try to please people. Worry about pleasing God. But if you've been in the social hierarchy, if you've been, a person of status, if you've had lots of people and deep roots of, the dynamics that come into play in these different types of social groups, that come along with you being included, then that's going to be much harder. Whereas an outcast that's been rejected by everybody, like David was even rejected by the rejects. So when you've been rejected by everyone, and your faith has been built into this mountain-moving faith where there is just no doubt about the power of God, of what God is capable of what God can do in an instant, and it's been built up, that faith has been built up in private, in isolation. That makes you a very, very unique and powerful weapon against the kingdom of darkness. There's this one part of the Bible that I love. It says, I will wield you like a warrior's sword. And so I just want to encourage you that as you are being fashioned into the instrument for God's purposes, and it's painful, and it has taken a long time, and it's been in isolation, and even the victories nobody saw, nobody knew, nobody celebrated with you. It was just these victories that you experienced alone with God, I just want to encourage you that that's the way he does things a lot of times. When God uses you in a powerful way, he is going to prepare you in a unique way. When God needs you to be different, he's not going to cultivate you like everyone else. So today, I just wanted to highlight the fact that for many of us, it has been decades of isolation. It has been quite possibly an entire lifetime of isolation and rejection and betrayals and hardships. And I just want to encourage you that it's for a purpose. Take joy in the suffering because God is preparing you. And when the time is right, he will make it happen, and it will happen so suddenly. And you know what? Your resources, you trying to figure out, like, God showed me I was going to be in this house, and I don't know how I would ever get a house like that. I mean, how is that going to happen? I don't have the money. I don't have the credit. I'm just working these odd jobs. I don't even have like a paper trail to prove income. When you're going through all this, you are wasting the day that could have been utilized and embraced and enjoyed in worship and in praise, because, that's how we follow with the childlike faith. Instead of saying, how is this going to happen, God? Just say, I can't wait to see how you're going to do that. I saw one pastor that made this reference, and I'll share it with you. He talked about how when you tell a toddler, let's go for ice cream, that toddler doesn't start to bring a lot of questions to you. That toddler is not like, well, hold on a second. Is the ice cream shop open right now? Do you have the money for the ice cream? Do they even have any of the kind I like in stock right now? And what's traffic like? How long is it going to take us to get there to the ice cream? And, and what's the weather doing? A toddler doesn't do that. The minute you tell a toddler, hey, we're going for ice cream, they are just celebrating. They are just, yay, and they'll do the things that you tell them to do very specifically. Get your shoes. Where's your socks? I know we saw some socks around here. Let's get your socks on. They'll do the things that you give them instructions for, but they are not concerned about the details beyond that. They are not coming up with things to worry about beyond what your instructions are, because they trust you. The Bible says that Sarah believed God because she believed the promise, because the one who promised, she knew to be faithful. I mean, for Sarah, it's beyond all logic. She's beyond the years of childbearing. But instead of focusing on how is God going to do that, let's practice having that childlike, toddler-like faith and just celebrating that he is doing that. We got the promise. He's going to do it. And I know it's hard. I know it's hard. But when those negative thoughts come in, just say, out in the name of Jesus Christ. I hold every thought captive in obedience to Christ. And just know that if God needs you to do something specific, he'll make it clear to you. Just like a parent would taking a toddler for ice cream. Get your socks. Get your shoes. Let's get ready. When it's time to do something specific, God will show you. And aside from that, just enjoy the day. Don't miss an opportunity to praise him and to worship him. And don't forget that praise and that worship will chase out the enemy, because demons hate it when we worship God. They hate it when we stand in faith. When our circumstances should be upsetting us, but instead we're proclaiming the goodness of God. We are worshiping God. We are praising God. Man, that really is a poke in the eye to the enemy. They hate that. Those demons, they hate that. And what they want you to focus on is the problems. What they want you to focus on are all the things that you don't know and that you don't understand. We serve a God that is omniscient. There's nothing He doesn't know. There's nothing He hasn't planned for, even our mistakes, even where we'd struggle, even where we'd stumble. He's already planned for it in His perfect foreknowledge. We serve a God that truly we cannot even fathom all He's done from beginning to end. So just like a toddler is able to experience joy in the promise without concerning themselves with all the details and all the potential problems, I want to encourage you to try to walk in that same kind of faith. And if you have already read the story of David, I encourage you to go back through it, because every time I go through it, I see something new. God unlocks another part of it and reveals something new to me. The Bible, reading it for yourself, is an adventure that just never ends. And the more I read it, the more I study it, the more I am just in awe of God's goodness, of His mercy and His power. If you've received a promise, even if your circumstances don't look like there's any way that promise could unfold and could come about, you're going to get encouragement from those pages. You're going to get encouragement from that time alone with Him. Follow Him with a childlike faith, because I promise you, He is capable. He is willing. He is faithful.